The sequence of events began the previous night, Mr. Magistrate, on Sunday, July 15th, the year 2012, at approximately 10 p.m., when a defendant and a second person left Manchester, Connecticut, with plans to go to the Cure Lounge, a nightclub in Boston. The second person is a friend and associate of the defendant known to the Commonwealth. The pair traveled in a 2006 silver Toyota 4Runner SUV, a vehicle that had been provided to the defendant as part of a promotional arrangement with a Rhode Island car dealership. The SUV was owned by and registered to the dealership and not to the defendant. Just prior to leaving Connecticut, the defendant was observed to place a revolver into the engine block of the SUV where it was hidden but easily accessible. Evidence suggests that in the months leading up to July 2012, the defendant had become increasingly sensitive and angered by what he believed to be people testing, trying, or otherwise disrespecting him when he frequented nightclubs in the area. At approximately 12 a.m. on July 16, 2012, the defendant and his friend arrived in Boston and parked in a garage at 274 Tremont Street, a short distance from the Cure Lounge. By coincidence, Daniel D'Abreu, Safiro Furtado, and three of their friends arrived at the same parking garage within 5 minutes of the defendant. The victims had traveled to the theater district from Dorchester in a gray 2003 BMW owned by Mr. D'Abreu's sister. They had previously socialized together at a family Dorchester cookout. None of the victims had been to Cure prior to that night. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the victims entered the foyer area of the Cure Lounge. As they showed identification and paid a cover charge, the defendant and his friend were escorted into the nightclub by a Cure employee. Witness testimony, corroborated by surveillance video from the entrance to the nightclub, indicates that there was no interaction at this time between the defendant and his friend or any of the victims. There is also no evidence that the victims and the defendant knew one another or had ever crossed paths prior to that night. In fact, none of the victims recognized the defendant as someone they had seen before, either in person or otherwise. The defendant and his friend proceeded downstairs, purchased drinks, and stood at the edge of the dance floor. Shortly thereafter, Daniel D'Abreu, while dancing nearby, accidentally bumped into the defendant, causing the defendant's drink to partially spill. The defendant became angered and increasingly agitated, particularly after Mr. D'Abreu smiled and did not apologize. There was no observed verbal argument between the defendant and Mr. D'Abreu, and there was no physical contact between them beyond that initial bump. In fact, neither the victims nor the security staff at the club were even aware that the defendant had become angered or agitated as a result of the incident. The defendant told his friend that Mr. D'Abreu had deliberately bumped him and was, quote, trying him. The defendant's friend quickly convinced the defendant to leave the nightclub and walked him outside just 10 minutes after their arrival. The defendant was captured on surveillance video, quickly consuming 2 mixed drinks as he walked out of the front door of Cure Lounge. For the next 5 minutes, the defendant's friend attempted to calm the defendant as they paced back and forth on the sidewalk leading towards the parking garage. Video surveillance from the outside of the nightclub captured this interaction. The defendant and his friend then walked across the street and entered another nearby nightclub. Within 15 minutes of their arrival at the second nightclub, the defendant pointed out a small group of men now entering that club. The defendant told his friend that this group included the man who had bumped him and spilled his drink. The defendant again voiced his belief that he was being targeted and disrespected by this individual and his friends, and that he believed they were now following him from Cure. Witness testimony and video surveillance revealed, however, that the defendant's belief was mistaken, as the victims never left the Cure Lounge until after 2 a.m. Shortly after these observations, the defendant and the person he was with at the second nightclub left and walked back to the parking garage. Those two men were captured on video surveillance from the parking garage, leaving in the same silver SUV. They drove around the immediate area, and at some point the evidence suggests that they pulled over on a street nearby. There, the defendant opened the hood of the SUV and retrieved the loaded .38 caliber revolver that he had placed there earlier that night. At approximately 2:10 a.m., the 5 victims left Cure Lounge. At 2:17 a.m., Daniel D'Abreu and Safiro Furtado and one of the surviving victims walked down Tremont Street to get to the car. At this time, the defendant's SUV was captured on surveillance video driving by and slowing down as it passed the 3 victims entering the parking garage. The SUV looped around the block and 3 minutes later slowly drove by again as the 2 other victims now waited in front of the parking garage for their friends to exit in the BMW. Following the second pass, the defendant's SUV pulled over and parked a short distance away. The defendant and his friend walked towards a parking garage and stood near the exit. At approximately 2:26 a.m., surveillance video shows the victim, Mr. D'Abreu, and Mr. Furtado, and the third victim exiting the garage in a BMW and picking up their two friends. As the BMW pulled out of the garage, the defendant and his associate got back into the SUV. The victim's car passed by and the defendant stated, "There they go." The defendant's SUV then followed the victim's car down Tremont Street. The defendant's SUV briefly stopped at a red traffic light and then quickly accelerated through the red light to catch up to the victim's car. The victim's car was stopped at the next traffic light at the intersection of Herald Street and Shawmut Avenue. At this time, the victims were completely unaware that there was any problem with the defendant or anyone else, and were similarly unaware that they were now being followed. The defendant's SUV pulled up close alongside the passenger side of the victim's car. The defendant leaned out of the driver's side window of the SUV with a loaded revolver in his hand extended out and stated, "Yo, what's up now?" and then a racial slur. The defendant immediately fired at least 5 rounds from a .38 caliber revolver into the victim's car. Witnesses reported hearing the clicking noise as the defendant continued to pull the trigger of the gun after all of the loaded bullets had been fired. Daniel D'Abreu suffered fatal gunshot wounds to his chest. Safiro Furtado suffered fatal gunshot wounds to his head. Both D'Abreu and Furtado were pronounced dead at the scene. The middle backseat passenger suffered a non-life-threatening injury to his arm. Immediately after the shooting, the defendant and his associate fled the scene in the SUV. While traveling westbound on the Massachusetts Turnpike towards Connecticut, the defendant stated to his friend, quote, "I think I got one in the head and one in the chest," end quote. The pair arrived at an address in Hartford, Connecticut at approximately 5 a.m. on July 16, 2012. Later that morning, the defendant searched the internet and watched television news for media accounts of the Boston shooting. Also that morning, the defendant contacted his cousin, Tanya Singleton, to come from her home in Bristol, Connecticut to the Hartford address. Singleton arrived and left a short time later, now driving the defendant's SUV and leaving behind another vehicle for the defendant to use. The defendant left the Hartford address later that morning in the car provided by Singleton. Thereafter, the evidence suggests that the defendant's SUV that was used in the murder was secreted in a garage at 114 Lake Avenue in Bristol, Connecticut, the home of his cousin Tanya Singleton. On July 17, 2012, the day after the homicides, the defendant rented a new car from a rental agency. Over the next several months, despite repeated calls and efforts from the Rhode Island car dealership to have the promotional SUV brought in for scheduled servicing and to even be replaced with a newer vehicle, the defendant ignored those requests. In the fall of 2012, the defendant expressed his interest in purchasing that SUV. When he initiated that offer with the dealership, the evidence suggests that he had not driven the SUV in months. The SUV was eventually found on June 26, 2013, in the garage at Singleton's home at 114 Lake Avenue in Bristol, Connecticut, by law enforcement officials investigating the June 16, 2013 homicide of Odin Lloyd. Evidence suggests that the defendant regularly visited his family at that Lake Ave address both before and after the homicides. When recovered by Boston police from the Singleton garage, the SUV was covered in cobwebs, had a dead battery, and did not appear to have been driven in a significant period of time. The interior of the SUV showed evidence that had been thoroughly cleaned, including visible streaks from cleaning solvent on the windows. Subsequent analysis of cellular telephone records for the phone used by the defendant on July 16, 2012, obtained by search warrant, corroborate witness statements placing the defendant at the scene of the murders, traveling to Connecticut afterward, and at other areas at relevant times. On June 21, 2013, Massachusetts State Police recovered a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver during an inventory search of a motor vehicle following a collision on Route 91 in Longmeadow. Forensic testing of the firearm revealed to a reasonable degree of ballistic certainty that this weapon is in fact the murder weapon used to kill Daniel Abreu and Safiro Furtado. The operator of that car in which the murder weapon was found is from Bristol, Connecticut, and has connections to the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, through other individuals. Mr. Magistrate, those are essentially the allegations.